Let me now continue with our discussion of the history of the development of the Wellhausian documentary hypothesis. The next figure in the history of the development is Heinrich Ewald, who in 1923 wrote a commentary on Genesis where he proposed what is called the supplementary hypothesis. He felt that the basic history of the Pentateuch was the E source, and that E was supplemented with other traditions, such as the Decalogue and the J source, which were older. Now, this supplementary hypothesis is partially accepted by the later documentary hypothesis, because sources that are not a part of JEDP are also believed to have been incorporated into the Pentateuch, according to the Wellhausen theory. The next figure is Hermann Hupfeld. Wrote a book on the sources in Genesis in 1853. You can see the title in German, the Quellen der Genesis. Distinguishes, one of the things he does is distinguishes P from E. He took the E source that people had identified heretofore, and he divided it up into two sources, E1 and E2. E1 used Elohim as a divine name, as in the creation account in Genesis 1, but differed in style and character from E2. And later on, E1 came to be called P by later criticism. Now, as for the dates, his order was P first, then E, then J, then D. P-E-J-D is the order of the sources in terms of chronology, according to Hupfeld. We next come to Karl Heinrich Graf, who in 1866 wrote a book on the historical books of the Old Testament. You can see the title in German there. He proposed putting the priestly law after the exile begins. And so some of P, what Hupfeld had called E1, really dates to after Deuteronomy in the exilic period, after the Babylonian exile. Whereas he felt the Holiness Code, Leviticus 16 through 26, dates earlier to the time of Ezekiel, but the rest of the laws of P are datable to the time of Ezra's reform. Now, he was very influential on Wellhausen, such that sometimes the documentary hypothesis, as Wellhausen put it, came to be called the Graf Wellhausen hypothesis. Graf ordered the sources chronologically as follows. He thought that the P1, which is historical part of P, was earliest, followed by E, followed by J, followed by D, followed by legal P, which he calls P2. And P2 is the two parts, the Holiness Code, and then the other legal section of P. Next character in this history of the interpretation is Abraham Küenen, who wrote on this issue in 1870. He advanced on Graf's ideas, arguing that both parts of P must date after Deuteronomy. Moreover, he argued that J was the earliest source. Küenen thus came up with the classical documentary hypothesis order of the sources J, E, D, and P. J earliest, E next, D next, P last. And that brings us to Julius Wellhausen. As we can see that by the history that we've given, Wellhausen did not invent the documentary hypothesis, but what he does instead is give the theory its classic statement and apologetic. In 1878, he published the famous Prolegomena to the History of Israel, in which he defends this theory. The main thesis of the Prolegomena of the History of Israel is that the Mosaic law, the Mosaic history, is not the starting point for the history of ancient Israel, but for the history of Judaism. In other words, it's not reliable history. He accepted the Grafian hypothesis that the Levitical law and the connected parts of the Pentateuch were written after the fall of Judah in 586 BC. In fact, he has a famous statement in this regard that the law comes after the prophets, meaning specifically the priestly law comes after the prophets. And thus the name Graf Wellhausen hypothesis comes into play, because he did depend heavily on the writings of Graf. Wellhausen acknowledges his debt to Graf. He says, at last, in the course of a casual visit in Göttingen in the summer of 1867, I learned through Rickel that Karl Heinrich Graf placed the law later than the prophets, and almost without knowing the reasons for the hypothesis, I was prepared to accept it. I readily acknowledged to myself the possibility of understanding Hebrew antiquity without the book of the Torah. The documentary hypothesis was the culmination of over a century of Enlightenment rationalist thinking about the Pentateuch. It came to be widely accepted in religiously non-conservative circles, and it's still a dominant theory in secular and liberal circles today, though considerably less so than a few decades ago. We'll continue in the next video a discussion of the arguments in favor of this view, followed by, in subsequent videos, arguments against it.